operations, you name it. IT security is at the top. So we have to make security easier, and we have to make our people work smarter, not harder. And that's really the emphasis that we'll talk about here. So I'm happy to host this distinguished panel. I'll let the panel introduce themselves individually. I'll facilitate some questions. I'm certainly interested in doing so. But this is your session. So there's a mic on this side of the room. There's a mic on this side of the room. If you have questions for the panel, please don't be shy. It's an open discussion. So with that, Steve, can you kick us off?
Sure. I'm Steve Whitlock from Boeing. I'm in charge of our long-term security strategy. And my interest in security automation is based on the change in how we do computing. We've seen a shift from, in the 80s, from computing focused on processing to building large amounts of data. And that data today is flowing between an increasingly diverse set of endpoints devices, and now going pretty much instantaneously instead of batch processing. It's just not something we can keep up with by doing it manually or with people, so we need to automate it as much as possible.
Okay, Dave?
My name's Dave Waltermire. I work for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm the architect for the security automation program there, and my primary focus is ensuring that the necessary standards are put in place to ensure interoperability and availability of data, to meet some of the challenges that Steve is speaking to. We're working with a variety of different standards organizations, including the TCG, to develop these standards, basically to break down a variety of information silos that exist within the enterprise. We want to ensure that we're collecting endpoint posture information in a way that it can be timely and useful to a variety of different consumers that are focused on security problems, operational challenges, and so forth.
Okay. Dan?
Hi, my name is Dan Griffin. I'm the president of JW Secure. We're a Seattle-based consulting company that specializes in custom security software development. My interest in the context of TCG and on the panel is as a security consulting company, our goal is to enable our customers to be successful, typically by integrating the latest security technologies in a way that works smoothly and is easy to manage for their customers. And so by reducing the burden on their customers, again, we tend to help make those solutions more successful in the marketplace. To that end, we've developed a demonstration with Microsoft and with Juniper for RSA this week that demonstrates several TCG standards and technologies in tandem that, again, set a very high bar using new security technologies in a way that is easy to manage for the IT administrator.
Okay, great, thank you. So Dave, I'm going to start with you, because you are responsible, or one of the people responsible for SCAT, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, how many people in the audience are familiar with the federal SCAT standard?
They're all in the back.
So this is good stuff. So I'm glad we have Dave here. Dave, can you tell the audience or explain what SCAT is, what the motivation for it was, and where it is in its life cycle?
Sure. So SCAT is the Security Content Automation Protocol. It's currently a suite of 11 specifications that work together basically in 4 areas. We have specifications that provide identification formats for common security concerns like CVE, the Common Vulnerability Enumeration for vulnerabilities, CPE, the Common Platform Enumeration, which identifies software, and CVE, the CCE, the Common Configuration Enumeration, which identifies configuration issues. As well as a variety of data formats that allow you to capture enterprise security knowledge relating to vulnerabilities and configurations, and scoring systems, things like CVSS, that allow you to score the relative severity of a vulnerability relative to other vulnerabilities. As well as a trust capabilities that allow you to sign and provide integrity over information that's communicated using these models. SCAP is a fairly mature effort. It's been underway for over 10 years now. It's currently adopted, the SCAP 1.0 is adopted in about 50 different commercially available tools, many of the tools that you may be buying. We're in the process, you're right, it is effectively a federal standard today. We're in the process of working through the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IATF, to take this work into the international community to achieve greater consensus around the approaches, to make changes as needed to address internationalization issues and to achieve broader international adoption. And that work is currently underway.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, when you hear about things like SCAP, I know SCAP is something that you're using widely at Boeing, but what's the business case for doing some kind of standardization so that you can have that standard view of the security profile of an endpoint?
Sure, and we may be using it to some extent. For us to use SCAP, we need it embedded in our COPS products, and it's in some, I don't know the extent we're using.
Okay.
Our real business case for SCAP and other standards from the TCG and the IATF is we have around 50,000 suppliers and several hundred customers. We don't control their IT environments, let alone their security environments, and we need standard ways of exchanging security information with them that don't depend on a specific product. So we're very focused on standard protocols and data formats.
Okay, and so that, tell me, is that something you're driving toward, or is it something that you're insisting on and that's actually starting to happen?
It varies with the area, so it's better with authentication than with machine state, for example. So on the authentication side, we're cross-certified with Certipath, which is cross-certified with the Federal Bridge for exchanging identity information.
Okay.
We don't have that capability with exchanging device state information. And we've had occasions where, say, a partner's machine that connected to us was infected and they didn't know it and no way to notify them.
I see. And Dan, so you could, what I don't want the audience to do is walk away and say, well, these guys are talking about theory, that these are standards, some things that the feds are doing, but no one's actually putting this to work. But you're actually building these solutions. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so where we see demand for SCAP and let me just say security templates more broadly, is a lot of our customers are kind of undergoing this metamorphosis, this evolution from traditional software into software services over the cloud. And what those customers inevitably realize is that there are all sorts of new operations challenges, and there's kind of some IT staff and actually developer retraining that has to happen in order to provide those services securely. And security templates actually play a big role where, with the traditional firewall perimeter model, these customers, let's be honest, may have been able to ignore that problem to some extent, whereas now with, you've got a broader class of machines receiving requests directly over the internet. Hey, what expertise, what previous investment that other groups have made in how to lock down these server roles can we apply to these machines and kind of leapfrog this big training problem that we have right now? And that's where standards such as SCAP and, again, more generally security templates, we're really seeing increased demand for that right now.
So a big part of the value proposition, what I'm hearing from you, is you get more out of what you already have versus adding another security console or adding another agent to a desktop. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate because you've got the latent capabilities in your typical Linux web server and your typical Microsoft Exchange server to actually make that machine operate fairly securely and still get the work done. But sometimes those settings are kind of hard to understand, especially for somebody who doesn't have a lot of deep security expertise. So use those templates and kind of solve that problem more cheaply, really.
Okay. One of the things I'm seeing in the market is that the need for better enumeration of endpoints in general is being driven by mobile. Because now it's not just a PC world, it's not even just a PC and Mac world, it's a lot of devices, and the Internet of Things is going to make that more so. So, Dave, in the SCAP or in your experience, I mean, how are you extending this so that it's not PC, Windows-centric, and it's more usable, especially with mobile being such a big federal initiative?
Sure. Well, first of all, there's nothing in SCAP that ties it to to any specific platform. It's a generalized set of approaches that that can be extended to any platform. I guess the one piece of SCAP is OVAL that actually does.
I'm sorry.
OVAL is the Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language,
okay.
And it's basically used to assess the low-level posture, essentially, of the endpoint device. And because it's working at that level, modules have to be written in OVAL to basically support specific platforms. And there are a variety of platforms that OVAL currently supports, including common desktop and server platforms, as well as mobile and network operating systems as well. But part of what we're trying to do through this IETF process is extend the reachability of these kinds of security automation approaches to basically any kind of device type. We want to begin to leverage more of the existing operations and management protocols that exist out there, things like SNMP and NetConf for network devices. And there are certainly other specialized protocols for other device types, as well as proprietary protocols that we'd like to incorporate into that process. And in doing so, we free the data that exists on those platforms as well to be assessed using the same kinds of approaches that SCAP supports. Another thing that we're trying to work on is to break away from this periodic scanning model that has existed in SCAP to move to a more real-time data collection capability. So you can essentially, whatever kind of endpoint you're working with, you can send a policy to that endpoint that says, this is the posture attributes that I care about. Notify me as those attributes are changing so that you can take more proactive measures relative to those changes, whether it be update their configuration state or software state to an organizationally authorized value or level, or apply access controls or other enterprise policies.
Okay. Audience, question for you. How many people are here are either implementing or interested in some type of continuous monitoring for security?
A lot.
Okay, so you've got the right audience. And so Steve, let me ask you, continuous monitoring something you guys are doing, is this are these all kind of common initiatives, or are those separate efforts that are going on?
So we have several centers around that are doing some continuous monitoring to give us a state of our IT infrastructure.
Okay.
But I would like to leverage some of the additional capability, which is why I'm interested in both SCAP and the IETF effort in this area. And then mobile devices are still particularly challenging. Desktop stuff, we've got pretty good observability of what's going on.
Okay, so when you say we'd like to leverage some of the additional capabilities, can you give the audience an example?
So I think especially mobile devices have come along a lot faster than both the ability to administer them and to keep them secure. But I want to go farther than just monitoring and go into an automatic self-correcting state, which some of the TNC protocols provide a foundation for, so not just monitor, but sort of have a self-healing environment.
Okay.
I believe that eventually we have to eliminate, people would set the rules and the policies, but we have to have the machines respond in real time because the threats are coming in real time. And you can't do that if you have to send a bunch of your SIM data to a person who's got to make a decision about whether to patch something.
Okay. And Dan, I can tell you want to add to this, so you probably have some examples of where you've done this already.
The challenge that we've seen with the kind of self-healing technologies, I think what has to be an obvious example is Microsoft's investment in network access protection it just wasn't successful in the market, let's be honest.
No one's was successful.
No, NAC more broadly, yeah. So because they're in my backyard, I see the Microsoft investments more up closely, but NAC was not successful. I think the self-healing capability in the Microsoft implementation was impressive. And I guess, quite frankly, I don't exactly know all the reasons that NAC wasn't successful in the marketplace. But an anecdotal example is, self-healing is great, but when you have a patch Tuesday and the vice president comes to work Wednesday morning and is quarantined for an hour because patches are processing on his or her laptop, that just becomes a non-starter. That solution is never gonna fly. So that said, those kind of problems can be worked out, and yet we still haven't found, we as an industry, we still haven't found the right way to kind of package that capability, I guess.
One of the things I hear from security professionals I talk to is it's sort of harkens back to the IDS versus IPS discussion, where people would say, I don't want any device blocking anything without me involved. And we're talking about automated healing. How have things changed? I'll start with you, Steve. How have things changed where we can have confidence that the technology knows is intelligent enough to make the right healing decisions without taking as Dan said, taking the CEO offline or taking a group offline?
So I think some of those decisions have to be based on risk. Let me go back to something that Dan said about NAC, though. So I'm not talking about healing your corporate intranet. I'm talking about the relationships between devices.
Okay.
I think assuming that you can set a boundary or perimeter around your network and keep everything pure inside is essentially a lost cause.
You've been saying that for years, too.
Well, yeah. You're inviting too many people inside, and most of you aren't inside all the time anyway. I would venture half the people here are doing email or something, and you're sitting on a network controlled by this building. But I do think that there is a role for trusted relationships between clients and servers and mobile devices, so endpoint to endpoint. And you can put more trust with the trust groups, the TPMs, in those conversations, and then use some of the health protocols to validate machines as they attempt to access sensitive information. And I think that has a better chance of scaling than just drawing a circle around everything and trying to keep everything bad out.
Okay. So the scale is based on policy then?
Yes. And this is, again, where it has to be automated or it won't scale.
Okay. And so one of the things that I think will be a focus at this conference is ease of use. Because, again, people just don't have the time. We need the technology to be more intelligent to help us do what we need to do. And so how easy is this stuff to use? Because that's another thing that security people tell me is, you're asking me to define a policy of this person on this device entering the network to do this. I don't know how to make access rules based on that. So how is that a concern, and how hard is that?
Well, part of the challenge I think that exists today is there are a lot of point solutions that exist around these kinds of capabilities. So maybe the protocols exist to carry the information, but how the information is made available for this kind of policy enforcement, how policies are written, tend to be largely platform and product specific. And that's part of what we're trying to break down. I think really to be more proactive about securing our networks, we need accurate and timely situational awareness over what's going on. And I think this speaks to where we're trying to break down some of the technological and platform-specific barriers. For example, getting software inventory information in a way that is useful to do enterprise policy enforcement, to do like attack graph analysis, more enterprise holistic vulnerability analysis, and then to take action. That action being maybe implementing compensating controls that aren't directly related to the device that actually has a vulnerability. That requires some degree of normalization of information across the enterprise in these various technological areas.
Is that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is that the TCG SWID, software ID?
Right, so one of the things that we're doing is around software ID tagging or SWID tagging. There's a specification in ISO 19770-2 that defines a common format by which software publishers can produce information about software, things such as identifying the software, identifying what files, executables, libraries, and other components are part of that software. Basically allowing that information to be sourced from the authoritative source, the software publisher or software vendor. This allows organizations to have much more accurate and actionable information by which they can base their vulnerability decisions. It allows us to identify vulnerability at the component level. For example, if a library has a vulnerability in it, it allows us to identify all of the software, essentially, that embeds that library. It allows us to accurately collect software inventory information off of a device in a platform-neutral, fairly agnostic way, supporting a lot of these enterprise use cases. This is not something that can be easily done in the absence of these kinds of standards.
Okay. So I think what you're pointing to, in general, there's a trend toward more publication of metadata and more use of metadata.
That's correct.
So Dan, because you're out there putting solutions together, how do you get this metadata? How do you normalize it? How do you use it? Or how do your customers do so?
Yeah, so going back to the example about setting up cloud servers and this kind of thing where you're using a security template, we ran into a recent case where the customer's existing hardened server template has a bunch of convenience tools copied into the tools subdirectory for the IT guy to be able to do whatever sort of analysis or raise network shares or look at server load, this kind of stuff. And none of the tools are code signed. None are packaged in an installer. A lot of them are open source, downloaded off the web. And so an interesting challenge that we've run into in looking at the opportunity, actually in SWID tags specifically, is, hey, what can we do to kind of start to make these points connect? Can we make it so that we create a de facto or like an ad hoc SWID tag in that situation where you're pushing out this gold image of a hardened server, and you've got a bunch of extra stuff on there that you just kind of need, and let's create a SWID tag that we code sign, and that way down the road, at least we know if there's a new tool that hasn't been blessed by the security team that's introduced onto that image, we can flag it because we have some server-side measurement capability to gather these SWID tags off of all the servers, and then it also uses some other endpoint management technology to see what other binaries are there, and then we do a diff, and we see that, something's been added that's not in the SWID tag list that we approved. That means something that's, something's unapproved. Maybe it's a rootkit. Maybe it's just a tool that we need to add to the whitelist. Anyway, we agree that it's an interesting capability. Obviously, there's some more work that needs to be done there to connect those dots.
Okay, and Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of points relative to what you're saying. One of the activities that my team is involved in is the National Vulnerability Database, and relative to that work, we score vulnerabilities and we identify software products that those vulnerabilities apply to. And in doing so, we basically go through a process where we have to do an archaeological dig of information that's available through a variety of security bulletins, vendor product websites, and that sort of thing. And so it's a very time-consuming, labor-intensive process that results in lower fidelity, lower accuracy information. Mm-hmm. Most of the information that we're gathering through that process is available at build time when software is being built. Yep. And so by enabling the software publisher to provide that information, we don't have to exercise those same capabilities. We can just basically consume that from the vendor directly. And then the other challenge that we have is really collecting that like you said, collecting that information from endpoint devices. There are a variety of different commercial solutions. They all implement their own package management processes. It's not normalized, and so the organization ultimately has to sort this out, creating mappings of product identities from, and vendors often provide solutions here, but this is something that again has to be replicated on a vendor by vendor basis or on a customer by customer basis. By having a more authoritative way of identifying software and their components, we can begin to eat away at those costs, essentially, to organizations to make the process more efficient.
Okay. And Steve, I know you're a big proponent of metadata and metadata use. I read there were some articles where you were talking about that, I think in Information Week. So how is Boeing looking at metadata or metadata capture, normalization, and usage?
So metadata is tough because you want to have data about the data, and when it comes to unstructured data, you don't want end users to have to fill out templates.
Right.
So one of the things we've done is we've written a tool that was originally designed to look for hidden data prior to releasing a document, say edits or things that have been cached in it. Mm-hmm. And we've reversed the tool to actually put in metadata, and it can scan a directory and put the data in. And we actually, last year and the year before, on the RSA floor, we did some demonstrations of that using some authorization vendors and some data tools, I think, in conjunction with Oasis. I did want to make one comment on what Dan and Dave just said, though. So from an end user perspective, I want that capability, but I want a policy person to be able to sit down who isn't an IT person and fill out policies from their perspective and have it generate and respond to those rules. Yep. I just want to get that out there. Some of the solutions we've looked at are too hard to use.
So it's one thing to capture the data, it's another thing to use the data. And so in your opinions, because you're working with the vendors, you're actually building solutions, are the vendors taking advantage of this and making those policies easy to create and mount and manage?
I can speak to that in part. So relative to SWID tags, we're seeing quite a bit of adoption as far as the publication of this metadata. But we're not necessarily seeing the same level of adoption on the consumer side. And we've been working within the TCG to develop the enterprise compliance profile, which profiles some of the existing TNC standards to allow software ID tags to be exchanged as part of the software inventory collection process. We're not necessarily seeing a significant level of uptake, although there is some adoption in that area of the enterprise compliance profile. So one of the things that we're doing at NIST, within NIST's National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or NCCOE, is we're developing a series of continuous monitoring building blocks. And the first one is around software asset management. One of the primary goals of the NCCOE is to accelerate the adoption of standards and technologies in the marketplace. And so through this building block, we're actually working with vendors to build commercial solutions around that demonstrate the use of TNC protocols and software ID tags to collect software inventory information. And we're hoping that that will increase the rate of adoption, essentially, of those technologies in the marketplace.
Okay. Anything to add, Dan?
Just general agreement. We aren't seeing the capability in the tools that we've been using yet. Quite frankly, we've got some SWID tag support in the demo that we put together with Microsoft and Juniper this week that we've got in the back section there. And really what we had to do with SWID tags is pretty much custom. I mean, we were able to gather some data off of the test clients that we had where certain packages, like from Microsoft, Adobe, maybe some of the open source packages that we were using, did install a SWID tag, which is actually excellent progress, quite frankly. But in terms of having a server-side tool to kind of gather and understand that information, we again, frankly, rolled our own for that. And my assessment is that that's kind of the state of the art right now. I don't know if you disagree with that, but.
I don't.
Okay.
Any questions from the audience? Once again, there's a mic right over here to my left, and there's a mic right over here to my right. And the gentleman jumped at the chance. I love it. Go ahead.
You see, that's the advantage of becoming a researcher. I can ask very challenging questions.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Is this working?
Yes.
First of all, I'm Lawrence Dobransky. I'm the Director of ICT Security at a large Canadian research-intensive university, University of Saskatchewan. I have 22,000 bring-your-own-devices a day showing up in my network. I'm hearing you get to the idea that the defense in depth is dead. We have to move to a data-centric, user-centric defense mechanism, but I haven't heard you say it outright. So I want to give you that challenge. We are deperimeterized. My freshman students this year in 5 years will not accept defense in depth in their workplace. I mean, someone said something about a vice president. We have enough problem recruiting individuals, but we're going to find they won't accept it. So how can we use what the technologies we're talking about today to shift that paradigm as we support the mobile, always-on workforce that's here today?
I would disagree that defense in depth is dead. That perhaps is a misuse of that term. Defense in depth is alive and well, and in fact is the solution to your problem. So Steve was kind of alluding to using metadata for more of a point-to-point capability, more of a point-to-point security authorization decision, rather than you're flat out quarantined off the network until you're quote-unquote healthy decision. And so in the BYOD case for your 22,000 devices, I think the vision here is what data can we gather from those devices across the various platforms, and what access control decision can we make before that device reaches whatever asset that you want to protect, a SharePoint server or a source control server or whatever it is.
If I may, I'd just like to add about that. I have no authority on anything with those 22,000 devices.
So the statement was, I don't know if everyone heard that. The statement was he has no authority to do anything with those 22,000 devices.
There are 22,000 students. I can put some perimeters around them, but they will not consent to have invasive software put on their machine. So that's what I mean with a breakdown in the current vision of defense in depth. I didn't say defense in depth is dead, that we're deperimeterized, and the current vision is no longer workable.
So I think part of the solution there, though, is enabling the kind of standards-based approaches that would allow those devices to communicate aspects of their posture, so that you might not, now hear me out though, so that you might not be able to directly affect changes to those devices, but you can certainly work to affect changes around to the environment around where those devices are connecting. So that might not mean that you're going to restrict access to that device, but it could mean that you turn on additional monitoring of the device. You put it on, a limited VLAN that only allows it to connect to specific kinds of services. The important thing to really be thinking about here is to come up with a way for the device to actually make some assertion about its current state, so that you can monitor the behavior of that device and actually catch it in a lie if that endpoint ends up being compromised. It can't lie unless you force it to say something about itself first. And again, these kinds of capabilities allow us to be more proactive and more dynamic about the kinds of controls that we put around these devices in the environment, which again is a defense in depth kind of strategy.
Yeah, so there's no implied agent per se, right? We understand you can't push an agent to your students, but what metadata is available short of that, right? And how can we increase that? Yeah.
Steve, I was going to say that, you're working with outsiders. You've talked about suppliers, and is that an analog to what this gentleman asked?
Yes, we can't normally push an agent to a supplier's, but if all of the products bought similar interoperable agents. But I want to respond to him a little bit more directly because I think, so I work for a large company, so we have centralized administration, and we'll maintain a perimeter just to keep the noise out, but I want to add more defensive depth. I want a tighter perimeter around devices. I think that as an individual, you don't want centralized administration, and you can't have it in your environment because students aren't going to want it. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't want a more hardened device that they might buy from an AT&T or a T-Mobile or somebody selling a phone or something, and that device could have a better way to communicate with both other individuals and with a university or a company. And so I still think there's some room for improving the security there without the centralized administration aspect of it.
Sure, and ensuring that the devices are secure by default, would help a lot. Not just in the enterprise environment, but in the home, consumer environment. But also taking advantage of some of the virtualization and containerization capabilities that exist on devices, where the enterprise might be able to communicate some expectations about how it would like secure storage to be established on a device, what kind of VPN connection might be established between a service and the device. By putting in place the standards that are necessary to communicate that kind of information, to communicate the secure environment that you would like the device to connect under, is also a way forward, I think, to improve the security of these devices without taking a very heavy-handed approach towards managing those devices.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you a good example of that. So I have a Chromebook, and it uses the TPM and some signed data values to verify the integrity of the OS every time it boots. I'd love it if my phone would do that.
Mm-hmm. Any other audience questions? Go ahead, sir.
Here, I'll ask one since I'm sitting right next to the mic. My name's Dan Sander. I work for one of the many Boeing suppliers you mentioned up in the Seattle area, Collinear Group. And as you know, we tend to, up in that area especially, things get categorized into, you have the aerospace industry, you have the IT industry, and Dan, I know you're familiar with that. We've seen a lot of convergence there. So I guess my question is to Steve primarily in the commercial aviation industry, as we move toward aircraft that are E-enabled, that are always connected, and from everything to internet access for the passengers to control services, flight control, aircraft position reporting, things like that. Are there some specific products that we're looking at implementing, and from a policy perspective, do we address it in a similar way to traditional IT, or is it critical infrastructure? As we see those things kind of converging in the commercial airline industry, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how we're addressing those issues. As that industry and the IT sector kind of converge a little bit with building a new aircraft? Thanks.
So,
could you repeat the question, sir?
I'm not sure. The question was about E-enabled aircraft and if there were similar approaches to security. If I got that right? Okay. And I'm from the IT part of Boeing. We have specialists actually in the aircraft design organizations that are doing the security in those areas. It's relatively new, as it doesn't go back more than 5 or 10 years. And those organizations have worked with us and leveraged some of our same techniques. They've also done specialized things because they're working more with hardware and in systems, real-time systems. So it's probably more akin to industrial control or SCADA-type factory challenges. Some of the certification requirements from the FAA require analysis of those areas as well. So I would say they're borrowing some tools and techniques, but they're also developing their own. I'm not specifically in that area, so I can't really speak to detail. But.
So I'm going to kind of dovetail on the question this gentleman asked, and that is, it seems like there's a misconception that defense in depth is dead, and you guys addressed that. What are the other misconceptions? For instance, we talked about the Jericho Forum and the fact that people thought that meant firewalls are dead, and that wasn't your intent. So what are the other misconceptions that you'd like to get on the table and sort of address based on all the standards, all this data-driven security?
So I can address the Jericho Forum part. I'm being essentially a founder, and remember, we dismantled last fall on our 10-year anniversary. But basically, the Jericho Forum arose out of a need to exchange information through perimeters. And the point of the Jericho Forum and coining the term deperimeterization wasn't that you didn't need some kind of perimeter, but that you needed to reestablish perimeters around your devices and data and services, because you had to open up your external perimeter to so many business partners. So it was very business driven and not technology driven. The old model of just having a firewall, not letting anybody in and sending an occasional email is essentially dead. My company does collaborative design globally with companies that require access to CATIA drawings, for example. Mm-hmm. But there are many other examples, and many of the original Jericho founders were actually out of banks. Mm-hmm. So it was a little bit of a misconception. We're saying the perimeter will probably remain as a thin filter. It's essentially becoming less useful other than a noise barrier. Cloud computing is another area that challenges the concept of a strong perimeter as well. So we really wanted to push the perimeter closer to the data.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think I have two misconceptions. So the first is, and I think I've been speaking on this theme, that Trusted Network Connect is really about network access control. I think the real killer application around the TNC standards is that it's a robust messaging protocol that can be used to communicate a really rich data set about endpoint posture information that can be used for a lot of enterprise policy decision making beyond just access control capabilities. We're looking to that protocol really from an SCAT perspective. It's kind of interesting. SCAT, being Security Content Automation Protocol, is really not a protocol. It's a set of data models. TNC is really about moving data with very little focus being applied around modeling the information that's being exchanged. It has a general purpose messaging layer through IFM, but there hasn't been a lot of work there. So we kind of saw a good fit, essentially, between these two efforts, because SCAT didn't have protocols and TNC really didn't have data models. And so what we're able to do by combining those is really communicate a much more rich set of information about the software inventory state and configuration state of endpoint devices that can be used by operators, by incident responders, as well as other security professionals that are trying to enforce compliance activities as well. So that's one area. And then the second area is about SCAP being essentially just a federal standard. We're seeing a lot of broader adoption of SCAP in the retail sector, the financial sector, as well as others, as well as internationally at this point in time. One of the reasons why we're going to the IETF to further work on developing international consensus around these approaches is to further enable the commercial solutions that have been built around SCAT that are supporting the federal community to be leveraged in other sectors as well, to really strengthen that capability.
Two misconceptions that I'd like to throw out there, or maybe just one, is that just because the NSA has contributed to a standard doesn't mean it's tainted and useless. NIST does work that fits that category. Quite frankly, the TCG does work that fits that category. The key point is that open standards don't necessarily produce the best technologies or the industry-leading technologies, but transparency is the best way we know to get security. And the vast majority of the technologies that we're talking about have been developed with that transparency. The flip side of that is that if you take a change that you don't understand, if you deploy a technology that you don't understand, you are inviting disaster.
That was good. That was, yeah. I'll do that too.
Thank you.
So, given that, and I asked you guys this before, And I'll start with you, Steve, because the Jericho Forum, where you were involved with, was a user organization. So in your opinions, why aren't end user companies, big General Motors, Renault, Hitachi, why aren't these big companies around the world saying to their vendors, you must adhere to these security standards or we just won't buy from you? Why isn't that happening?
So I think some are, but I think it's taken a while to catch on. I think the initial message was regarded as, throw away your perimeter, and which is a ridiculous statement,
right.
And it was misinterpreted. There has been some support from large system vendors have been members of Jericho, Qualys, Symantec.
Well, in addition to Jericho, I mean, just if SCAT goes to the IETF, becomes sort of an internationally recognized standard for content and for automation, why aren't end users, why isn't Boeing saying to its security vendors, look, you either support these standards, which will benefit us, make automation easier, integration easier, or we won't buy from you?
So we are doing that some, and I just think maybe Jericho's a little bit early. But I'll give you a good example of capability we have now that we didn't have 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Our Juniper, our VPN vendor, supports the machine health protocols that came from the TNC and the IETF NIA working group.
Yes.
And we can do a system check, say a crude check before a device enters the perimeter. Next layer in, Microsoft on SharePoint supports these also for devices that already have an internal IP address. So we can have a lighter check for a device coming in the perimeter, and then if we have a SharePoint with sensitive data, we can do a much more thorough check just for that SharePoint.
Right.
So that's a good example of both defense in depth and vendor response to those needs.
So is there it may not be black and white, but is there a preference for buying from vendors who support these standards?
I would say it's one of the things on a checklist, but there's many other things.
Sure. Okay. Dave, I mean, you must use SCAP if you're a federal agency, correct?
Yes, that is the current policy. And that certainly has driven a lot of adoption within the federal government. But I think to some degree, though, to really be successful in the long run, these have to be perceived as consistent, best common practices in the industry. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we're out working in the international community to ensure that level of adoption. It's kind of a weird dichotomy, though, because, I think to be really successful, so in the short run, we need to push end user organizations to ask for these standards and their implementations. But in the long run, these things just need to become commoditized. And end user organizations should just be using it without really having to ask their vendor for a specific standards-based solutions. Much like routers, switches, and firewalls work today, right? You don't have to ask for does it support TCP/IP and those fundamental standards. So I think it's kind of a weird dichotomy where I think in the short run we really need to focus around increasing adoption and awareness, but in the long run we just really want this stuff to be commoditized and baked in.
Yeah.
And
Dan,
Please.
I was just going to add that
go ahead.
the cybersecurity framework, which NIST just finished, is oriented that way and has some of the categories and subcategories that are focused a bit more on security automation and things.
Which was just published, correct?
That's correct.
Done. Final standard.
Well, at least this
revision.
This revision.
Okay. Now, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
I think that an interesting challenge for TCG Technologies is that many of them are very technical. They're the kind of thing that really needs to be in the plumbing and needs to not be something that the customer has to try to understand and become a checkbox item and that kind of thing, because again, this dichotomy of we want to build awareness of these capabilities, but we don't want to set the bar so high that nobody understands them, because that's self-defeating. And there is, I think security as a whole, maybe the IT, you could argue the IT ecosystem as a whole kind of goes through that cyclical aspect of standards can be a checkbox purchase decision, but a lot of it just kind of comes out of the fact that if you plug the device in and it doesn't work with your SAP system, it's like, well, okay, well then we're not going to use it, right? So,
right, and that's something that we're trying to. That risk is something that we're trying to break down with the NCCOE efforts, really, because we're trying to provide a venue where commercial tool providers can come together and build and demonstrate interoperable solutions that solve a security challenge. And so through those demonstrations, we're able to work through issues around interoperability and integration, which can be a barrier to adoption.
yeah.
Okay, so I think we have about 2 minutes left, so if we could quickly go through. Dan, I'll start with you. Just what's the 1 or 2 takeaways that you'd love to leave with this audience?
I think I gave it by previous comment. I think I'm all set. I'll leave it at that.
Really?
Yeah.
You got the bully pulpit, man.
I'm good.
Dave, go ahead.
I think I would say we need your help in ensuring that this work continues to move forward. As customers, we need you to ask your vendors to ensure that they're implementing these kinds of solutions. As end user organizations, we also need you to come and participate in the standardization discussion. I know it's difficult to get time to do that, but your voice is very important in the context of the standardization discussions in the TCG and the IATF. If you're interested in participating in these efforts, the Trusted Network Connect Working Group, the IATF SACM Working Group, please come see me afterwards. I'd be glad to provide you with information. As vendors, we want to work together with you in various ways through the NCCOE and other efforts. I think my point is really we need your engagement to really make these efforts successful.
Steve?
Sure. So this automation area is earlier than some areas of security, but it's very important. If we don't do some of these things, we won't be able to handle the complexity, the relationships that the gentleman with the university brought up, which is just as important as business relationships. And we won't be able to handle the threats that are coming in the next generation.
Okay, and I'll just, the final word, the TCG, the stuff that's going on at NIST, some of the stuff going on at the IETF, we as a security industry tend to have our heads down putting out fires and things like that, but there is a lot of good information, so I would go ahead and look at it, and there's plenty that can elaborate on what we talked about today. So thanks a lot for coming, thanks to the panel, and have a great show.
Thank you.
Thank you.